The Dragonback series by Timothy Zahn. Book 1, Dragon and Thief. Chapter 1.
Dracos! Come on, Simbi, shake a scale!
Dracos looked up from the systems monitor he'd been watching, his ears swiveling upward toward the voice. Pulfer, his Shantine host, was halfway up the ladder to the Haven Seeker's main navigation bubble, looking quizzically down at him.
Come on, where?
Dracos called back.
We're here! We've arrived! Our job is over!
Hardly, my good but lazy Kara, Pulfer said dryly. All the long-range navigation may be finished, but we still have to double-check the location on that planet down there. Come on, let's go.
Very well, my good but slave-driving Shantine,
Dracos replied. Crouching low, gathering all four paws under him, he leaped over the bank of monitors, and, incidentally, the two Shantine working on them, and landed precisely at the foot of the ladder. He would have preferred to jump directly to the navigation bubble and skip the climb entirely, but there was another Kada crouched at the monitor station on the lower bubble deck, and there wasn't enough room for Dracos to land there without bowling her over. Wrapping his paws around the ladder's side rails, only the Shantine used the ladder's rungs, he started up. The Haven Seeker was alive with activity and quiet commotion today. Small wonder. After nearly 2 years in space, the four bulky ships of the Shantine Kada advance team had finally reached their goal, the world known as Iota Clestis, and everyone aboard was excited. Several times as Dracos made his way upward, one or the other of his pointed ears twitched around as an odd noise or fragment of conversation caught his attention. Pulfer was already in his seat at the wraparound control board, working busily, when Dracos reached the bubble. For a moment, he paused at the top of the ladder, gazing out at the blue-green planet turning slowly beneath them. An uninhabited world, or so their contacts in this region of space had assured them. Uninhabited and unwanted. Exactly what they needed.
'Twas night and blackness all around. Kada and Shantine held their ground.
You just going to sit there and daydream? Pulfer called over his shoulder. Or were you taking a moment to admire yourself?
And why not?
Dracos countered, arching his long neck as he pretended to pose.
Have you ever seen a more handsome representative of the Kada people?
If you think I'm going to answer a question like that in here, you're crazy, Pulfer told him, his voice rippling with good humor. Wait till we get down to the planet where I've got room to duck, then ask me again.
Never mind,
Dracos said. In truth, he hadn't even noticed his reflection in the smoothly curved plastic of the bubble until Pulfer made his comment. Now, though, he took a moment to focus on the image. It wasn't a bad face, really, he decided. The long, triangular head was mostly proportioned right, the glowing green eyes beneath the bony protective ridges properly spaced, the spiny crest extending from between the eyes over the top of his head and down his long back were just about right, though perhaps a bit too narrow. His long muzzle with its razor-sharp teeth were well-shaped, though some of the teeth themselves were a little crooked and his forked tongue stuck out a little too far whenever he tasted the air. His scales were a decent enough color, bright gold with red edges, though as a child he'd secretly wished they'd been gray instead. The rest of his body wasn't visible in the reflection, but he could picture it in his mind's eye. The body long and sleek, as befit a Kada warrior, the whip-like tail a little too short as it relentlessly beat the air. After 2 years, he decided, it would be good to feel ground beneath his paws again. Turning to face Pulfer's broad back, he crouched and leaped. His outstretched front paws touched the Shantine's bare shoulders and flattened out, sliding along the skin in both directions along his arms. As the rest of his body reached Pulfer's, each part altered from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional form as it flowed onto his host's body. A split second later, the transformation was complete, leaving Dracos stretched like a living tattoo across Pulfer's back and legs and arms.
Anyway, I'm not sure I'd trust you to judge Kada beauty,
he added, sliding his now flat head along the skin of Pulfer's shoulder and around to his chest so that he could see the indicator lights better.
And just for the record, I was neither daydreaming nor admiring myself. If you must know, I was composing an epic poem about our journey here and the beginning of new hope for our peoples.
Were you now? Paul first said, working at his control board.
Yes, indeed,
Dracos assured him. He stretched his front legs out and away from Palfer's arms, the limbs becoming three-dimensional again as they left the Shantine's skin, and began punching in code on his own set of control panels.
I was going to give you a good part in it, too.
I'm flattered, Palfer said. Really? Okay, here we go. Can you get that anterior starfix going?
Already on it.
Thanks, Palfer said. If I were you, though, I wouldn't go writing up this voyage as a success just yet. I noticed that no one seems willing to give us a straight answer as to whether we're going to be welcome here. Dracos lifted his head from Palfer's shoulder, letting it become three-dimensional again, for a better look at the proximity display. Was that something flickering in and out at the very edge of the nav sensor's range?
You worry too much,
he said smoothly, laying his head flat against Palfer's skin again, and continuing to key in his star scan.
Why would anyone object to our using a planet no one else seems to want, especially when we're willing to pay for it?
There are all sorts of reasons they might object, Palfer said. Refugees in general aren't always welcome, you know. They're even less welcome when they've got enemies as dangerous as the Valaga.
The Valaga will never find us,
Draco said firmly.
Not here.
Palfer shook his head. I hope you're right.
Spacecraft approaching,
a Shantine voice called across the control complex.
Recognition signals,
another voice put in, this one a Kada.
It's our contact.
I would say that confirms we've got the right planet, Palfer remarked, hunching his shoulders as he stretched his arms forward over the control board.
Seems reasonable,
Dracos agreed as he again lifted his head from Palfer's skin and studied the main sensor display.
Iota Clestes.
He pronounced the syllables of the planet's alien name carefully.
It has a certain rhythm to it.
Yes, it does, Palfer said. I still vote we rename it.
It is hard to find a good rhyme for,
Dracos conceded. There were 4 ships showing on the screen now, small and compact.
Odd. None of them matches the profile of the ship the contact has used before. At least not according to probe team records.
Palfer abandoned his stretching and leaned closer to the display. You're right. You suppose one of the local governments decided to send a welcoming committee.
And they offered our contact a ride?
Or came without him, Palfer said, his tone ominous. Maybe this planet isn't as unwanted as we were led to believe.
Perhaps.
Dracos rumbled in the back of his throat.
Still, they do have the correct recognition signal.
Point, Palfer agreed, swiveling around to a different section of the board. Let's see if we can get a better look at them. The image on the screen wavered, then came back sharper and clear. Draco had just enough time to notice the oversized engines and multiple weapons bubbles dotting their hulls. And then, to his amazement, 3 of the bubbles on each of the ships popped open in perfect unison, and 12 missiles streaked out toward the Shantine Kada ships. Alert! Someone shouted. We're under attack!
All warriors, to your stations!
The calmer voice of Shantine Commander Chad cut over the sudden pandemonium from the control complex deck below.
Defensive response only. This may simply be a case of mistaken identity. Comm stations, talk to them. Tell them who we are.
We are talking,
a Kada voice insisted as the ship began to shudder with the firing of its defense missiles.
They're ignoring us.
Watch out! They're breaking formation, Palfer warned, leaning close to stare out the bubble at the incoming ships. They're splitting up, 1 for each of us.
Batteries, free fire,
Chad ordered. Concentrate on crippling their weapons. Maybe it's still not too late to talk some sense into them. Palfer clicked his tongue. I don't like this, Dracos, he said quietly. 4 of them, 4 of us. This isn't a chance meeting. They were waiting for us.
If they were, they didn't get the details very clear,
Dracos pointed out.
Missiles that size against hull armor as thick as ours? What do they think they're trying to prove?
And once they did know what they were up against, why split up their firepower? Palfor added. Why not concentrate everything on one ship at a time?
Or just turn and run, Draco said. They're up to something, Palfor. The question is, what?
Palfor never had a chance to reply. Instead, the ship sweeping toward them provided the answer. From a weapon bubble near its center came a sickly yellowish flash, and a slender cone of violet light lanced out. Dracos caught his breath, his mind refusing for that first awful second to believe what he was seeing. Here, hundreds of light years from their beleaguered worlds, it was impossible that their enemy's most terrifying weapon should be ignited against them. Yet there it was, the all-too-familiar cone of writhing violet light twisting its way toward the aft end of their ship, the weapon no shielding could block, and that no living being could survive. The weapon called simply the Death.
Evasive! Chad shouted. All ships!
But it was too late. As Dracos watched from his perch on Palfor's back and shoulders, he could see that there would be no chance for any of them. All four attacking fighters had ignited the violent beams now, focusing them on the sterns of their chosen colony ships. And over the all-ship intercom, Dracos could hear the horrible shouts suddenly cut off, as the Shantine and Kada in the Haven Seeker's engine room were caught in the beam and died.
Evasive!
The commander shouted again, his voice hard and desperate. A second later, Dracos found himself grabbing for the grip bars at the edge of the control panel as the Haven Seeker twisted downward out of the violet light, sweeping slowly forward along the hull. How their pilot had managed to coax a maneuver like that from such a big lumbering ship he couldn't imagine. It was clear their attacker couldn't imagine it either, because for a few seconds the violent beam burned harmlessly through space above the ship as its target dropped out from under it. At the same time, a full salvo of missiles shot from the Haven Seeker's flank toward the fighter. Dracos held his breath as the fighter twisted madly to get out of the way. It successfully evaded most of the missiles, but then the law of averages caught up with it, and the last two slammed full into its side just after the death weapon.
2 hits! Palfor called. The Death!
He broke off, sagging slightly in his seat as the rest of the lungful of air escaped without words. There was nothing else to say. Despite the torn and blackened metal on the fighter's side where the Haven Seeker's missiles had struck, the violet beam was still twisting its way out into space. It swiveled down toward the Haven Seeker, still driving away on its evasive course, and settled again on the colony ship's side. Almost as if nothing had happened, the beam resumed its steady progress forward. So too did the cries of the dying. With a shudder, Dracos reached out and shut off the nav bubble's intercom. There was nothing he could do to help the Shantine and Kada back there. Nothing anyone could do. The cries continued, more faintly, coming from the intercom speakers on the control deck below.
This is impossible,
Palfor murmured. He sounded more bewildered than frightened.
How could the Valaga be here? How could those ships have the Death? I don't know, Dracos said. It doesn't look like we'll have the chance to find out either.
No, I suppose not, Palfor said, his voice almost peaceful. Ashantine was unafraid to die, and for a brief moment Dracos envied him that calm. The Haven Seeker was still pitching away from its attacker, but the enemy was wise to its tricks now. The violet beam remained steady, continuing its slow sweep forward. In his mind's eye, Dracos could see his companions' bodies slumped in their seats or lying crumpled on the deck as the beam snuffed out their lives and then moved on. The Shantine bodies would linger for a while. Those of the Kada, he knew, would already be turning two-dimensional and rippling away into nothingness. A Kada death left no body for his friends to mourn. The beam was nearly to the control complex now, and Dracos could feel a slight and unpleasant electrical tingle along the scales on that side.
Here it comes,
he said. Oddly enough, his voice sounded almost as calm and peaceful as Palfor's had, even though he was far from feeling that way.
It's been an honor to be associated with you, Palfor. Wait a moment,
Palfor cut him off, leaning forward and pointing toward their attacker.
It sputtered just then. There, did you see it? Yes,
Dracos said, frowning. The yellow source glow was indeed flickering, and now so was the violet death beam itself. Had the near misses from the Haven Seeker's missiles done some damage after all? And then, with one final flicker, both the yellow and violet lights went out.
They've shut it off,
Dracos breathed, blinking in bewilderment. Was this some kind of cruel trick? One last gasp of false hope for the few survivors here on the Haven Seeker's bow before their unknown enemy turned the death on them again. But the weapon remained off. Dracos watched, afraid to believe it, as the fighter began to pull up and away.
What are they playing at?
He wondered aloud.
Do they think they got all of us?
I would say they're just saving themselves a little trouble, Paul Force said grimly. Take a look. That last maneuver put us into the atmosphere. Dracos hissed around his tongue. Paul Force was right. The thin white condensation trails were smoking off the tips of the antennas rising from the hull. Commander Chad seemed to have become aware of their danger at the same moment.
Full lateral power,
he shouted sharply.
No, not responding, the pilot called back. Control lines are out. Drosh, Mintuk, get to the engine room, Chad snapped. You'll need to operate the drive manually. Do you want us to go too? Paul Ford called, starting to unstrap. No, you two stay there, Chad said. Landing sensors are also out. We'll need you to guide us in visually. Paul Ford glanced over his shoulder, his eyes briefly meeting Dracos. Dracos could guess his thoughts, as such a feat would be nearly impossible to carry out. But there was nothing for it but to do their best. Yes, sir, Paul Force said, resealing his restraints. Everyone to your stations, Chad said. There was little hope, Dracos knew, and he had no doubt that Chad knew it too. But the commander was a Shantine warrior, and he would never simply give up without a struggle. Not while any of his crew remained alive. Prepare yourselves, Chad added. One way or another, we're going down.